Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from around the world. My name is Allie Vanden Herrick, and I am the Director of Marketing here at ShareVault. I would like to thank you for joining us for our webinar discussion today. This is the 71st in ShareVault's webinar series, and our topic today is predictable failure and how to avoid it for early stage life sciences companies. Based on the large number of registrations for this discussion, this is clearly a popular topic. Before we begin, I'm going to briefly cover a few logistical items. We'll conduct a quick poll, and then I'll introduce you to our speaker. We'll then kick off the presentation, and at the end, we should have a few minutes to respond to audience questions. First, a few logistics. As a reminder, this is a 60-minute event scheduled to run from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific time. Secondly, your individual audio will be muted in order to minimize background noise. But if you have any questions you'd like our presenter to address, please submit them at any time through the Q&A feature located in your Zoom webinar control panel. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And note that's the Q&A panel, not the chat panel. And lastly, our presenter has generously offered to make the slide deck and a recording of today's presentation available. You will be notified by email when they are released. We also welcome your feedback after the webinar, which enables us to improve future webinars. We would be grateful if you would please take a moment to reply to the survey we send in our follow-up email. All right, so we'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsor, Iranier Biotech Consulting. Iranier provides consulting services in stakeholder ecosystem discovery, executive relief, consultant coaching, medical affairs, clinical science, and clinical operations. With over a decade of experience in the life science industry spanning devices, drugs, veterinary products, and diagnostics, Iranier Biotechnology Consulting has a rare perspective on what it takes to bring an innovative product from concept to commercialization. To learn more, please visit iraniibiotech.com. And a big thank you to our friends at Iranii Biotech for their contribution to making this webinar happen. All right, today's panel discussion is hosted by ShareVault. Many of you in the audience may already know about ShareVault's leadership as a provider of secure cloud-based business file sharing software and virtual data rooms for a wide variety of due diligence applications, including M&A, partnering negotiations, board communications, vendor and other third-party relationships, and to maintain a secure and organized central repository for all business critical documents. What you may not know is that we also offer quick and easy integration with Box, Dropbox, Office 365, SharePoint, and DocuSign. And we have added many new features in our latest release, version 4.2.1. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and a shift to a remote workforce, cyber criminals are taking advantage of organizations that have not yet implemented safe business practices to manage a deployed workforce. It's far too easy to lose control of confidential documents during this shift, but we at ShareVault are eager to help. ShareVault is the only cloud solution that is instantly deployable to function anywhere your files need to be protected. Learn how we can help enhance your organization's remote work capabilities during COVID-19 with Dynamic Native File Protection, or DNFP. Schedule a one-on-one consultation to learn how ShareVault can help. And for a limited time, we're offering 2 free additional months to new users affected by the coronavirus shutdown. Visit us online at sharevault.com or reach out to us via the chat feature. All right, let's get going then. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lucia Mokris. She is the founder and managing director at Iranii Biotech Consulting. Lucia coaches current and aspiring life science founders through stakeholder ecosystem discovery, a robust and intensive model for establishing product market fit and understanding the needs of the complex landscape of decision makers that will determine the path to market. Using an evidence-based approach to their product development plan enables founders to gain traction and develop an investable technology and business model. The skills learned in her training can be used again and again to start new companies, develop new pipeline products, and rapidly adapt to changing economic, regulatory, and competitive landscapes. And I suspect some in our audience today may recognize Lucia from her frequent speaking and writings on topics of interest to early stage life science entrepreneurs. We are thrilled to have you with us today, Lucia, to get your valuable insight on this challenging topic. So welcome, and please feel free to begin your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Allie, and thanks everybody for attending today. I wanted to start off by just running through my background to kind of give you some context about where and how I came to this work that I'm doing now. So I started off in the medical device industry, kind of these big company pedigree with some work at Abbott and very familiar with the corporate world, but made a leap to becoming the chief medical officer of EpiBiome, which was when I joined a seed stage, or actually even pre-seed stage, biotech company in the infectious disease space. And one of the really interesting things about that experience was being able to go through, coming from the corporate world, really diving into the startup ecosystem, not just being in a startup, but being involved in so many of the very rich landscape of support systems that we have here and available in the Bay Area. So we were in the inaugural class of the Illumina Accelerator. We were a JLabs quick fire company. We went through the Springboard Enterprises advisory program, which is a program for women-led companies. And I welcome anybody who's interested in learning more about that program to reach out to me after this webinar. I'm happy to share more about them. Those of you in the Bay Area will be familiar with the California Life Sciences Institute FAST Advisory Program, and also the NSF Innovation Corps, both as a participant with EpiBiome and later became a teaching assistant for the program, and recently mentored a team through the national version of the program. And it's really this combination of accelerators and incubators and advisory programs, and then the more structured format of the Innovation Corps that really led me to develop the model that I have now as an independent consultant. So as Allie mentioned, my independent consultancy does include more traditional biotech or life science activities like the clinical, medical, and regulatory affairs, but I also have a real passion for supporting early stage life science companies through what can be a really painful growth process. And, not to get too Rumsfeldian with people, but taking the unknown unknowns and turning them into known unknowns so that you can go and then solve for those for your company. And the reality is that this is all work that you have to do yourself. It's very tempting to hire consultants and bring in advisors to just tell you what to do. And I hate to be a traitor to my own kind of consultants and say, just be cautious with that, because it's a sample size of one, right? So, and one person may have a great experience and very informed opinion, but you really do want to, as they say in the Innovation Corps, get out of the building and do a lot of discovery work on your own. And we'll dive into the reasons for that shortly. But that's where I developed the ABCs of life science innovation. ABCs, obviously, the acronym for Aranei Biotech Consulting. And that was convenient, right? Did not plan that when I set out to name my company. But and if you're interested in that name, by the way, you can go on my website. There's an about page at the end that says what's in a name, and you'll see the history behind that rather confusing and difficult to pronounce name. So the idea with what I was doing with my consultancy at this point is really helping organize and codify what I had learned so that the company formation and the idea formation around the product that it's pursuing, whether that's a device, a drug, a diagnostic, can really be executed much more efficiently And like a coach, like just like you'd hire a cycling coach or a running coach to be able to provide that structure, the feedback, the accountability, and the guidance through that discovery and validation process. So let's go ahead and get started with the rest of the presentation. And for those of you who are not current or aspiring life science founders, what I really want to encourage you to do through this presentation is to think about how this concept and the spirit of the concept applies to you in your business and in your life. So how do you go about determining who the decision makers are and the influences are that impact your job and your ability to make decisions? What motivates them? Which ones maybe have influence that you didn't realize that kind of surprised you? And then knowing that, you can build a more robust strategy around how you're going to get your agenda through. So if you're a startup, obviously your agenda is to get a product funded, to get your company funded, to get, your product onto the market. If you're at a larger company, your agenda might be to advocate for getting internal funding, or to focus money on a new R&D effort, or even if you're looking at M&A activity and looking at strategic business development, how you want to understand the landscape both internally within your company and externally with other decision makers in order to make those good strategic investments or strategic acquisitions. So while this, I can't speak to every single member of a diverse audience in a single presentation, I just really invite you to kind of critique this presentation as it's going along and think in the context that you would use it. What's missing here? How would you do it the same? How would you do it differently? What's the key message that you want to take away? And I think then you'll all be able to gain quite a bit of value from that. So with that, there we go. So this is a kind of a standard slide. It gets presented. For those of you who don't know what the innovation core is, the concept of customer discovery is not a new one. It's been around for years. The Lean Launchpad course by Steve Blank that got popularized at Stanford and got co-opted by NSF and NIH and for instruction of startups that had SBIR grants. And the whole framework for this teaching, and actually one of the reasons why I started this business, is based on tech. So you are going to see some data in this presentation, like this slide, that is actually, if you dive into it, really driven from the tech industry. Having said that, it is really directly applicable to the life sciences industry as well. And so when we look at this slide and think about, okay, really, no market need, how could that possibly be? Because doesn't everybody have a great idea? And the whole reason they came up with their great idea is that they're, having the best next thing since sliced bread. But it really is a recurring theme over and over and over again. And so, and a lot of these things kind of tie back into that. So if you have no market need, you could also see how you could easily run out of cash because you're sort of spinning your wheels, maybe getting out competed because somebody else understands the market better, et cetera. Obviously there's a lot of variables here, especially in biology, but this is the crux of the thing is really that understanding the market is quite key. So the common trajectory for a newborn idea, whether it's something internal to maybe a big company, but most often looking at startups that are coming out of, you know, academia, or people coming out of the tech industry going into biotech, or even experienced founders who have lots of or experienced biotech people who have lots of experience maybe at a larger company and think, you know what, I could do this on my own. I'd rather do my own company. And everybody's very drunk on the Kool-Aid initially, because the excitement of discovery can be intoxicating. And if you think about, in particular, coming from academia, especially in the life sciences, and this is a big differentiator between the life sciences and the tech industry, is that it can take years or even decades of research to understand for example, a molecular mechanism or pathway, and understand its role in disease, or understand, you know, the technology to put a very novel diagnostic together. It can honestly represent people's life's work. And, you know, that might be for, you know, established PIs, but even if you're a postdoc or a PhD student, that is your life's work up to that point. You're young, so you haven't had that many years of life yet, but it truly is something that people become more emotionally invested in than they probably recognize. And it can be really hard to learn the hard lessons. And unfortunately, when these startups fail, if they're lucky, they were never able to raise money in the first place. But a lot of people with charisma and a good slide deck and a convincing story can get investment. And what I've really set out to prevent is, you know, number one, good ideas from kind of missing the mark and not getting investment. So I want to see the good ideas invested in. And then secondly, understanding if your idea is missing the mark early, so that you don't go out and raise a bunch of money only to kind of fall on your face. So you don't want to be in the position where you've raised a seed round and then you're unable to raise a Series A, or you've raised even a Series A and you're unable to get to that next step. Although obviously the farther down the road you get, in general, understanding whether there's you know, an unmet need and there's a place in the marketplace becomes less relevant, and obviously biology itself kind of gets in the way. So but you know, fundamentally, when people start off, nobody wants to be told that their baby is ugly. And so it's a very difficult lesson, and it's something that people don't want to hear. They often don't want to hear critique. Even if the idea fundamentally is a solid one, the devil is in the details, and people are very reluctant to hear that that, you know, their beautiful idea is maybe not as beautiful as they thought it would be. So moving on, I want to provide some context so you know where all this is going, and then we'll focus more on stakeholder ecosystem discovery. So this is the business model canvas. This is Osterwalder's work in the book Business Model Generation. It was obviously then co-opted by the Lean Launchpad programming and subsequently the Innovation Core. So for those of you who are familiar with those programs, you'll recognize this chart. But basically, for those of you who are not, we're going to focus on two areas of this. Again, this was developed for the tech industry, and so I've actually developed my own business model canvas specific to the life science industry, and it's not called the business model canvas, it's called something else. But the key thing that we're going to focus on today are understanding customer segments and like who your customer is, and then I'm going to critique that that statement in a second. And understanding what the value is that you provide to those customers. So if you have a stakeholder and you understand what their needs are, what drives them, what motivates them, and you understand what pain you solve, what gain you provide. The combination of those two things is product market fit. So when you hear the term product market fit, what it just means is that you understand who cares about what you're doing, and you understand why they care, and how it improves their life. That's product market fit. So that's the first thing I wanted to go through. The second thing I wanted to go through is the idea of hypothesis testing. And so basically the methodology of all of this is not just to go out and ask a bunch of questions or collect a bunch of data and then sort of, write it all down and say, okay, well, we did it, we did our homework, but rather to really use the scientific method in order to understand the market and understand the decision makers in your market. And the majority of you, I imagine, have a scientific background, which means that you are already a pro at this. You already understand the idea of a hypothesis and of a null hypothesis, so proving the opposite of what you actually think is going to happen, to make a more robust test. Then how to kind of design, how am I going to experiment? How am I going to get data around my idea? And then when you have a bit of data, say, okay, what does this data mean? Is this heading in the direction that I thought it was? Or do I need to adjust my hypothesis because I might have been off a little bit? And that's an iterative, continuous cycle of hypothesis testing, refinement, hypothesis testing, refinement. This is something that you really already know how to do. And so you're not going to be learning anything new today. You're just going to be learning how to apply what you already know in a way that you might not have thought of before. So that's some of kind of the background and just the methodology and kind of what we're driving towards that I wanted to talk about. But now I kind of want to dive into one of the gripes that I had with the way a lot of the customer discovery and marketing material is framed. Again, this is not a new idea. Marketing has always been about understanding your customer. If you think back to Mad Men and the scene where he's presenting he has the genius idea to present on a slide projector carousel the key moments in his life, and it just really, oh my gosh, it really just impacts everybody. Understanding your customer, understanding what drives them is not a new idea. The issue that I have with a lot of the way this is talked about in the context of the life sciences is that it's not as simple in life sciences as understanding who pays for a product or who uses a product or who benefits from a product, because those things are all different. And so what we have in the life sciences is a true ecosystem. So rather than a customer, I call them stakeholders, because everybody has a different stake in a life science product for a different reason. For some people, it's an impact on their health. For some people, it's an impact on their success rate or how they measure their own personal success. For some people, it's money. There's a lot of different stakeholders in this ecosystem, and it's truly an ecosystem in that you cannot have success if you've missed even one of these groups. So let's talk about who these groups are. So obviously patients, people want to, a lot of times when people form their company, it's many times it's for a personal reason. You know, they've had an illness or an injury, or a relative or a friend has, or, you know, they're just very altruistically motivated, which is why a lot of us got into biology and the life sciences in the first place, or into the life science industry, because we really care about healthcare and the well-being of people. So yes, patients are one. Physicians, obviously, you know, people really focus on those, and say, well, these are going to be the people who are prescribing our product, and you know, they're all going to want to use my device, or they're all going to want to use my diagnostic. Regulators, of course, you know, everybody know if you have this talk is obviously geared towards a regulated product that requires regulatory approval. Even if your product is direct to consumer or does not require regulatory approval or clearance, there's obviously the other elements of this would still be into play, but a lot of people forget about payers, you know, and the role that payers might play. Potential acquisition partners, people who may be co-developing the product, or eventually doing M&A activity with your company. And then finally, what are the interests of the investors? So let's dive into these just a bit. So patience is a tricky one. A lot of times the trajectory is sort of, you start off your company or your idea, your product for the patient. Again, maybe it's a personal story, you know, maybe it's a scientific interest, but you think, you know, I'm doing this for the patients, and the patients are all going to want this, because what patient wouldn't want to be cured of this disease, or have a better outcome with this surgery, or have a more accurate diagnostic? And then you start diving into this ecosystem, and you sort of discover, like, oh my gosh, these patients actually have no say at all in what drugs or devices or diagnostics are available to them. They're kind of at the mercy of the system. And even though ultimately we're doing this quote unquote for them, they're truly not a customer, because they have no decision-making power, and they are not the ones ultimately paying for the product, even though, you know, we all kind of are. But let's not get too caught up in that. But you kind of get my gist, you know, in terms of, you know, the insurance companies and the hospital systems, or the direct payers generally of these products. And then you know, and you might think, like, okay, well, actually the patient is not a customer. Yes, they're going to be a beneficiary of this at the end. I would challenge that, because I think the third kind of evolution that you go through in discovering, and why would you want to go out and talk to patients before you have, you know, really launched your company, or have really gotten too far down the road with your product, is the issue of compliance. And I think that patient compliance is way overestimated, and I've seen this over and over and over again with my clients and with other companies that I've mentored, that the rationale is, well, this product is going to totally help them. It's going to totally solve this horrible disease or injury or whatever it is that they have. And so, of course, they're going to go in 3 times a week for an infusion, because even though going in 3 times a week for an infusion kind of sucks, it's much less sucky than having that disease, right? Well, you might be surprised, you know, or, you know, so thinking through things like, and it might not be that your product idea is bad, but it changes, for example, how you think about formulation, or how you think about use, or how you think about human factors on a device. So obviously patient compliance really matters, because number one, if the patients have anything to say about it during a clinical trial, it can really disrupt your clinical trial data in terms of especially the efficacy metric, but potentially for some products, it can even be a safety issue. So if you think about the use of corticosteroids, typically, if you're started off at a high dose, if you've ever been put on steroids before for an acute issue, that dose tapers off over time. It's incredibly important to stick with that schedule, because if you don't, you can go into what's known as an Addisonian crisis, which is no fun. And so patient compliance is something that may or may not be a challenge for you. And I'm not saying it's going to be a challenge for every single person and every product, but you want to have done the exercise of not just thinking through that, but actually going out and validating that, and kind of figuring out if your proposed, again, dosing schedule, route of administration, formulation, use case, et cetera, are going to be palatable. Because it's great, you might get to market, but if nobody's using it, you can get outcompeted because somebody figured out a better way to do it. So this is solving a problem for you that, yes, might be potentially way down the road, but it will become a problem, and you'll kind of sit there going, man, if only 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we'd really had thought this through, we wouldn't be in this position today. So again, this is really geared towards setting you up for long-term success. Physicians. So a lot of people think, okay, well, it's really just the physician that is going to drive this, because they're the ones who prescribe it. And again, I'm assuming that you have a prescription product. If you don't have a prescription product, just stay with me here and kind of think through, again, the idea here being who are the decision makers and what drives them and motivates them. But how much, what does drive those physicians' decisions in what they use or what they prescribe? What healthcare system are they in? Are they in a private independent hospital? Are they in a larger corporate hospital? I think of something like Banner Health in the Arizona area. Hospitals get bought out by corporations, and as they become corporatized, they, are subject to the management practices of those corporations. So the latitude that they might have had to prescribe something that might have been on formulary for an independent hospital might go away when they become part of that larger hospital system. Or what if they're in Kaiser, and how does Kaiser, what does Kaiser make available to its physicians for use in hospital, and is your product an in-hospital, inpatient product, or is it something that's prescribed and is something that they just pick up at the pharmacy? So, and how does the physician behavior impact the patient access to those drugs, depending on if it's in an in-hospital or out of hospital? How does formulary work? How do you get something on formulary in the hospital or not? Thinking about physicians in terms of being influencers, where do physicians get their information when it comes to making these choices? And who do they listen to? And who are the influencers? And maybe that's going to inform how you want to design your clinical trial in terms of where your sites are going to be, because obviously getting the KOLs, in those areas, and getting those KOLs, so those key opinion leaders, to manage those studies and manage those sites, and then ultimately, have the publications and have the respect and the following of the physicians in their field is really important. But be careful about that, right? Because there's lots of products out there. There may be lots of competing products out there with your product, and which physicians might actually be saboteurs, which physicians actually have an interest or a stake or, a passion for a different product that is competing with yours. And it might be a direct competition, and it might be an indirect competition. It might be just a completely different approach to solving the same problem. And so really understanding where physicians stand on your product and the degree to which they influence and don't influence the use of your product is really, really valuable, and also can help inform the design of your clinical trials when you understand how, when, and where they would use it, and what their current pains are. So again, this is not just about, we're assuming you know, that you're going to get regulatory approval and having good marketing. This is prospective planning for how are you going to design and conduct your clinical trial to get information that matters to physicians and to patients. Speaking of which, regulators, definitely a stakeholder in whether your product gets to market. And understanding what data they're going to need for safety and efficacy is really important. And I won't belabor that too much because it's kind of obvious. But what I think a lot of people don't consider is how that fits into all these other stakeholder needs. And so people will sit there and design a clinical trial to really only with the goal of getting regulatory approval, because they think that that's the big hurdle. To be honest, it's truly not the biggest hurdle. It obviously it depends on the product, and it depends on the regulatory landscape, and it depends on, you know, the market landscape with respect to you know, these other stakeholders and these other variables. But that's my whole point about the ecosystem, is that people think about regulatory approval and the endpoints of a study that would lead to regulatory approval as the be all and end all. And it's only one. So once you can come to agreement with the agency, I mean, thankfully, you don't need to go around talking to lots of different people at FDA to get concurrence, you know, with your approach, the way you would, you know, understanding your stakeholders from the patient perspective or the physician perspective. But you do need to think about a global regulatory strategy. So understanding the endpoints and the metrics that would be important for FDA might be different for other geographies like Japan or Europe or Canada or wherever it is that you want to be. So understanding in advance what the requirements, not just for safety and efficacy, but how the study is conducted, you know, what data can be shared, you know, or used across borders for approval or not, is really important. And I do include this in stakeholder as an element of stakeholder ecosystem discovery, because I feel like these are stakeholders. They are part of the decision-making ecosystem, and understanding them sooner than you think you need to does inform your development life cycle. And just to make a quick point, it's not just the design of your clinical trial, but it walks all the way back to your R&D effort. Because again, if you're thinking about, you know, things even as just as simple as formulation, you know, that goes back to the very beginning. It's like, what are you actually going to make? What are you going to build, and how are you going to build it? And so super important to understand that. Payers, I feel like, at least here in the Bay Area, people are getting that more and more. I feel like 5 or 6 years ago, you know, it was kind of this big reveal, you know, like, oh, payers, yeah, they make a difference too. And I feel like that conversation is just, you know, with all the great, you know, content that we have out there now, and the explosion of webinars like this and podcasts and great blogs and articles, people have more and more access to this information. And yet I still see this mistake made over and over and over again, where people just think, again, okay, I got regulatory approval. You know, the physicians are all shouting for this. The patients are all shouting for this. Everybody's thrilled, and falls flat on its face. So even though the payers are not the ones who physically benefit from the product, as in they're not the patient, and they're not the one prescribing the product, so they're not the physician or using the product, if in the case of a device or a diagnostic. Their concern is how does this help me save money? And I don't mean that in a overly negative sort of way. I mean, I know that there's a lot of, bad understanding and perception about, the healthcare system, but I think we could all agree that, having a more efficient healthcare system is a good thing. And a lot of ways that payers save money is directly related to patient benefit. So for example, metrics like reduced hospitalizations or reduced duration of hospital stay, or decreased dependence on needing other drugs. So yes, these things make people money. And I know in our culture, we have, issues with the healthcare system and money. But think about this in terms of those things also benefit patients. They benefit all of us, for all of us to be in the hospital less and to need fewer drugs. So, and having said that, thinking through, okay, so what metric are we going to need to look at in addition to our clinical safety and efficacy? We may want to look at economic metrics and understand, does our product really solve, make things better in terms of the cost of healthcare for that patient and for the healthcare system? So does it reduce surgery time? That is a endpoint that you might not have thought of including in your trial, but boy, is it nice when you can go back and when you're seeking reimbursement, say, here's actually the metrics that we have on that now is, the surgery time was reduced, anesthesia time was reduced by X number of minutes or even hours. Hospitalizations were reduced by X, rehospitalizations were reduced by X, and all the other variables that I mentioned. So really understanding what the payers would be looking for and what value can be provided to them upfront as relates to your specific product, again, gives you a bigger, more complete picture, even as you're designing and formulating and thinking through your product before you've ever gotten to preclinical or clinical trials. Just a super important piece of information to have. Potential partners. So a lot of people don't think through early on they get asked in a pitch, well, what's your exit? And people give the line, oh, well, if we will consider doing an IPO, but we're also open to, being acquired or we definitely want to be acquired, but they don't really think through, okay, who's going to acquire them? Why are they going to acquire them? And what are the motivations of those companies for their strategic acquisition? So understanding who your potential partners are, both in terms of what their business development strategy might be. And remember that can be a area in which they wish to expand their portfolios or bolster their portfolios, but it also may be a strategic acquisition in terms of your product being shelved because they see it as competition and they just want to acquire it and put it, away. So that's something to keep in mind is what are the motivations of your potential, acquisition partners, but also some of these companies, one of the great things that they can do is many of them, and this used to not be so prevalent, decades ago as it is today, but have their own venture arm. So they are willing to make strategic investments in companies that they're interested in. And also thinking about the idea of co-development. And this doesn't necessarily have to be with a big company. It can be with another startup, where if the timing is right, you can sit there and say, well, you guys have, this companion this diagnostic, and you want to get it through. Well, we have a therapeutic. We basically both need to examine the same cohort of patients. So why don't we go in together on, conducting a trial where we can partner on that effort, and everybody kind of benefit, and we'll make a data sharing agreement, and we will see that kind of everybody benefits and from this very efficiently run trial. Sometimes the partnering can be even earlier. So if one of these companies that's very well resourced really has a strong interest in your asset, they may even help with stuff that's kind of easy or no brainer for them, like doing your talks, helping with your talk studies, or helping with some of your early development activities. But you don't know that until you've kind of gotten out of the building and talked to them early on about your idea. So you don't want to wait until you really need a partner to find out that nobody's interested in partnering with you, right? So finding that out really, really, really early. The other key thing about that is these partnerships are about building relationships. You are not going to call Novartis and have a conversation and have them falling head over heels and saying, how soon can we get you into our labs or into our pipeline? It is about, getting to know each other, about them being able to gauge your progress, and to gauge your progress and your aptitude, they need a benchmark. So to come to them and say, I'm at this point today, is all well and good. And it doesn't matter how impressive that point is that you're at. What really sinks in more is seeing you again in 6 months, in 9 months, 3 months, a year, and saying, well, last time we talked, we were here, but now we're here. And that's when the minds really get blown, right? That's when they get impressed. That's when they say, okay, you're really onto something. You know what you're doing. You're putting a good program together. So that's another reason to talk to these people way earlier than you think you need to talk to them, because you build that relationship. You kind of get them cheering for you and celebrating your progress with you, and getting them much more excited than they would be if you had waited, and then the first time you reach out to them is later on. And then finally, obviously, investors, and what kind of endpoint are they going to want? And what do they care about in order to put money into your business in the first place? And so obviously there's an issue of ROI. But like I say, there's venture capital investors, but there's also strategic investors. There are family office investors, that may be much more motivated in terms of the patient and the unmet need than strictly the ROI. So really thinking through who is my investor and what kind of reaction do they have to my product idea, and you really need to listen to that feedback. So that's I won't belabor that group too much, but obviously they're a key point of this ecosystem. So how do you do all this? So when you and this should be customer discovery, not customer delivery. Stakeholder ecosystem discovery is not going out and pitching your idea to patients and pitching it to physicians and everybody else. And here I deviate a little bit again from the tech industry version of this customer discovery, where it's verboten to even mention what your product is. You're supposed to just ask people what their unmet need is, and then you design that. That's great if you're doing a piece of software or a gadget that you can just pivot on the spot. Biology and life sciences, don't work that way in general. I feel like it's much more efficient and effective to kind of cut to the chase about what it is that you are working on, but don't try to sell it to the people and convince them of the value. Kind of talk about, hey, I'm developing a new, synthetic version of a drug that was up to this point has been animal derived. And, the reason I think that that's, what I'm trying to do is reduce the manufacturing inconsistencies that come with an animal derived product and solve for that. And, here would be the kind of the benefits of doing it that way. Kind of, what do you think? Would love your feedback. Tell me about, how would you use this? Would you use it? What would you need? It's kind of hard because you can say, what would you need instead? And it's sort of like, if you've worked 20 years on finding a molecule for, a specific target, them telling you what they need instead doesn't really help you, unless you're able to deliver on that. But you kind of get the point, right? So it's not pitching to them, it's really listening to them. And so you want to kind of outline what it is that you're doing and what your scientific and your technical approach are, depending on the audience, or what your business approach is, again, depending on who you're talking to, but then really, really, really listen to what they have to say. And I've seen so many startup founders sort of like they act like they hear, but they don't listen, right? So they take down the information, they take down what the person said, they thank them for their time, and they go straight back to their original idea. So really taking the time to let the feedback sink in, asking follow-up questions, asking like, tell me more. You want to know where all the hurdles are going to be before you start, so that you can plan for them, right? So this, again, is borrowed from the tech industry, but it's just an example of the difference between pitching, telling people a bunch of features, like, this device has easy to use knobs, or this device automates this thing that had to be done manually before, or whatever it is, or this drug is a tablet instead of an injection, and focusing more on what the value actually is. So what pain does it solve for them? So for example, like a route of administration, or a difficult surgery procedure, or whatever it is, or what gain it provides. So thinking in terms of the pain and the gain when you have those conversations will be much more productive for you than getting caught up on technical features, which is a little bit of a less helpful conversation. We don't have time to dive into that too deeply, but basically this then leads you to your product market fit, which is understanding who your stakeholders are, understanding what drives them, what lights them up, is how you develop an investable business model. And finally, to tie it all together, oops, why that went backwards. Let's see. Seems like I just lost control of my, oh, there we go. I am not sure what is happening.
Perhaps Esteban can drive if you want him to.
Yeah, if we can, Esteban, if you could just advance to the final, the tying it all together slide. Keep going. There we go. So what this means at the end of the day is that with all of the data and the information that you've collected from all these different stakeholders in the ecosystem that determines whether your product will get to market, again, any one of whom can be a real linchpin in your plan, even though you have success in the other categories, you can develop a really investable business thesis with which to get grants, with which to get partnerships, with which to get venture capital. So that when you are pitching to people and they are saying, challenging you or kind of kicking the tires on your idea, you can say, hey, this isn't just our Kool-Aid drunkenness. We have gone out and we have spoken to X, Y, and Z, and this is the feedback that we got. Or if they challenge you on something, you could say, I'm so glad you asked that. We actually know the answer to that because we went out and we spoke to these people already, and here's what they said. It just gives you a much more robust approach to your product development life cycle. And it also teaches you a skill set that then is iterative, so that when the regulatory landscape changes around you, when the economic landscape changes around you, when the competitive landscape changes around you, you have this skill to go, okay, we need to reach the conditions, the environmental conditions have changed. We need to retest some of these hypotheses and see if they still hold up. Even if none of those things have really changed notably, the time it takes to do your early development, especially if you're working on a drug, can be very, very long. And you kind of want to periodically check in on these things and make sure that they are still true before you have, get too deep. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions. You can advance the next slide, Esteban.
Thanks, Lucia. What a helpful overview and presentation. Yes, let's go ahead and turn to audience questions now. We have one that just came in. How and where did you find the potential investors to to the startup business?
Yeah, it's really, I think that it's really key if you can take advantage of any of the accelerator programs that are available to you, whether they are virtual or whether they are physical. I think about the CLSI program out here or Springboard. A lot of universities have, if you're coming out of university, have programs for this. That they can start helping you with those introductions and helping you get prepared. Taking advantage of the programming available to you and being really resourceful and expanding your network to the extent that you can. So again, going to meetings, going to any kind of event that you can where there might be investors, obviously this is why JP Morgan is such a frenzy. JP Morgan Healthcare Conference is such a frenzy every year in San Francisco. So I think number one, really working on your network and leveraging your network and figuring out who can help you and who can start providing those introductions. And if you are able to talk to an investor, again, I think the best way to start this is not to say, hey, we want to pitch to you, but we would like your advice. Because I think if you ask for advice, you can get a much better audience, a more ready audience than you can just saying, hey, we have a great idea. Do you want to hear about it? Because the answer is probably no. But if you ask for advice, you can get a huge amount of information, like I say, in terms of the customer discovery. Second of all, you do get on their radar. And if they are interested, they will let you know. And thirdly, always in any interview you have with any of these stakeholders, with who else should I talk to? Would you be willing to provide one or two introductions? And that's also how you can grow your investor network. It's very hard to get your foot in the door, but once you do, never end a conversation without asking for another connection or another introduction, and always frame things and truly treat them like advisory sessions rather than pitching. When you are ready to pitch, you will have investors, a group of investors probably that you'll have a little bit better access to. If you don't have any, you're probably not ready to pitch anyway.
Thanks, Lucia. We have one more question, even though we're probably going to go a little over, but we might as well take it here. Being life sciences is so capital intensive, and in some cases, like in orphan drugs with no huge market, how do you convince investors around the value proposition?
I think that you have to look to companies like Audentis and BioMarin and look at what their business models have been to understand how they've been really able to leverage the rare disease market to the extent that it can be. Obviously, the incentives for shorter pathways to market and the orphan drug programs are one things that can attract investors, just because even though the return on investment may not be there in terms of the big market size, the money that they save in just the general development cost and G&A and overhead in the number of years, you know, because it takes overhead just even to keep a company going through all the discovery process and clinical development process, can be attractive. But that's also where, you know, a traditional investor might not be as interested in the rare disease space, and the focus may need to be more on trying to assess, you know, potential partnerships with some of these larger rare disease players. But again, you know, those rare disease players have their own agendas. It's a really, really, really tough space to be in. But again, I would look also at the rare disease companies that do exist, you know, the larger, you know, recently successful ones, Audentis, Ultragenyx, and others, and see who their investors were. And that can be a really, you know, interesting piece of information too. Sometimes you can find that in the form of old press releases, you know, well, they'll announce, you know, a series close or, you know, an investment lead. Sometimes you can go on websites like CB Crunchbase and CB Insights to figure out, you know, who's investing in who. So that can be another way to look into that. But it may be a combination. A lot of those are probably combinations of traditional venture capitalists. Grant funding is a really big one. Private family offices that may have an interest in that specific disease space, and then potential company venture arms of companies that are already in that space.
Thanks, Lucia. We do have one more question, so if you're available, I'm going to go
Sure.
ahead and ask it. You can keep it as short as you'd like. Somebody is asking for advice on using a third-party intermediary for fundraising during various phases of funding activities.
It depends on what you mean by using a third-party intermediary. If you are talking about using a third party to help you with your customer discovery, I think that it's always recommended that you do your own, honestly, even if as a CEO and a CMO. And this is why I sort of coach people through this, because it's sort of like if you're already busy and it's like, oh my God, I don't have the time or the energy to go to a gym, but my coach is going to kill me if I don't. Not that I'm going to kill you, but, you know, just having somebody help with that accountability and kind of like cheering you on, or, you know, either the carrot or the stick, whatever works better for you, to get you to do that work yourself, because it's always the question, a lot of the meat of those conversations is in the back and forth and the questions that get asked and answered. And a third party is just never going to be able to pick up on a comment that a stakeholder might make, that you might have picked up on and said, oh, wait a minute, maybe I haven't communicated this clearly, or maybe they're not understanding, or, oh, that was interesting, I haven't really thought about that. All of that kind of thinking is not going to happen if you rely on a third party. Having said that, I have helped companies do that, and can help companies do that. And the rule that I would make is I will only do that for people if they really are going to listen to me when I come back and say, guess what, your baby is ugly. Because it can be really easy to blow off a third party and say, you know, they don't know what they're talking about. But it's different when you're hearing it from the person's mouth. If you're talking more just about having third parties make introductions to VCs, sure, go for it. But all the introductions in the world aren't going to help you if you don't have an investable product ready to go, and like you haven't done this homework. But if you've kind of done all this homework and then you say like, we're gonna hire somebody to help make these introductions, they may or may not be great introductions. I mean, it's always kind of a crapshoot, but the point being is that once you've had that conversation with those VCs, again, always following up with who else should I talk to? Who do you think would be interested? I'd love your advice. Even if it's and especially if it's kind of a no from them, just getting that follow up and feedback is really important.
Thank you so much, Lucia. This is an amazing amount of helpful information. We've already gotten a few comments through chat. They appreciated this, the excellent material you've presented today. So just to remind those of you that are still here, we will be sending an email when the presentation slide deck and recording become available. So keep an eye out for that. And I just want to say I sincerely hope that this was helpful to you in your endeavors to bring something to market that could help people. Very impressive set of goals you have all set up for yourself. I'm very grateful for people like you. And thank you again to our speaker, Lucia Mokras. Very, very interesting, insightful presentation. I wish you all a wonderful remainder of the day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.